Just want to talk real quick about the Greenland situation and possibly even the Iran situation. I've already talked about the Venezuela situation, the potential constitutionality or lack of constitutionality of it. Um, from what I understand, things aren't going great in Venezuela, but that's just different channels that I listen to. Um, do I think that uh, there was all sorts of corrupt stuff going on in Venezuela that was potentially carrying over into the United States? Yeah, it seemed to be pretty obvious since the 2020 election when you started learning more about where those machines were developed and the nature of Venezuelan government and what have you. So uh, I'm not overly confident in my analysis of it, but it seems to potentially be an Article 1, Section 8, Clause 10 moment, which we're talking about offenses against the laws of nations to define and punish those. Okay, so, and once the law has been passed through the Article 1, Section 7 process, it can be enforced. But now let's move on to talking about Greenland. So I believe in interpreting the Constitution in the tradition of the founders and through the words of the prophets of my church, and then, of course, just reading the Constitution itself. I see the tradition of the founders as Jefferson and Madison mainly, but several others too. Just they are the two that seem to have had the most honest analysis of the whole thing, and that whole whatsoever more or less type of attitude towards the whole thing, which is part of my church's doctrine, and so I choose to trust them more because it's in the spirit of truth and the way they speak, and that matters. That matters a lot to me. And I also believe then in looking at that tradition of the founders, but also that would include Washington and Adams and Monroe. So we're talking about things like the Monroe Doctrine and the concerns about entangling alliances, everything like that seems to matter, right? So I believe it's Article 1, Section 8, Clause 11 that says that Congress shall have the power to declare war. And an interesting aspect about the notes from the Constitutional Convention that James Madison took, and he didn't believe we should strictly interpret the Constitution through the view of those notes. He thought we should just understand it through the understanding under which it was ratified. But it's still the same. The word is to declare war. Congress has the power to declare war. And part of why they changed the word, apparently they originally meant to say make, and Madison says, no, we need to change it to declare because we need to have this single unitary executive be capable of being immediately responsive to immediate threats. And that's kind of a big deal. And so if you look at a lot of, first off, the preamble says to form a more perfect union. One of the problems with the union was it didn't have a single unitary chief executive, a leader, somebody who could be that one taking in the information, receiving it, communicating it to Congress, whatever he needed to do, and then also sometimes just spontaneously responding without waiting for approval based on the situation, as is obvious in the notes from the Constitutional Convention. So there's that, right? So just because he used, war machinery, say, for example, let's talk about Iran for a second here. Nowadays, this isn't the day of muskets and cannons, okay? Was Iran getting helped to develop something that they could have been pointing straight at us? And might the president have had information on that? He seems to have targeted directly the nuclear facility. I think I've heard Joel Skousen, compliment him on how well things were carried out. And I think he also complimented him on how well the Venezuela thing was carried out. Not to say that Skousen doesn't like to also rip on Trump simultaneously. So it's not like we hate Trump or we're a huge fan. We're just trying to see things clearly, have clear thinking, right? As President Oaks would exhort us to have, right? And so take a look at his BYU speech for more information on that. So thinking about the Greenland thing here, we're talking about adjacent land or adjacent territory that potentially affects us severely. we're talking about preventions of meddling in it, but the United States apparently has veto power with the UN. But we've already been told by President Benson, he said we should just get out of the UN, and that it was a bad idea. There seem to be a lot of weird things about the UN, but anyhow, I don't think that the UN keeps us from doing a whole lot. The UN was created through the Article 2, Section 2, Clause 2 process, and then also there was a UN cooperation bill passed at the same time in 1945. I think I'm saying this correctly, through the Article 1, Section 7, Clause 2 process. Uh, so I know it has some preventions on why wars may be carried out and what have you, but then we've seen Russia, who also has veto power. Apparently, I'm not an expert on the UN, but it's treaties are part of the supreme law of the land. You need to acknowledge that. That's Article 6, Clause 2, and it has been through the legitimate treaty process and the legitimate bill writing process, right? That we participate in the UN. So I don't think, though, if Russia's not restricted from doing what they did, then the United States isn't restricted either. Okay, so that's the way I'm going to analyze that for now. This is just me like talking. I'm trying to put food for thought out there for everybody else that maybe doesn't think this way. And then there's NATO. We're part of NATO. Now, Greenland, though, is also part of NATO, right? The problem is, this is an entangling alliance. And I agree with J.D. Vance when he recently spoke to all those European nations and how they're getting away from their old priorities, and they're starting to, sacrifice their sovereignty, not keeping their borders, right? And what is it, religion, morals, or something? I don't know. Anyhow, why would we create these absolute entangling alliances? I see the wisdom of the founders. I saw President Benson rip on that. I saw J. Reuben Clark, I shouldn't say rip on it, but basically say it's a bad idea for us to keep getting involved in these entangling alliances. We're violating our founding by doing that. So how do we handle that? I don't know. Does Trump have some? But let's talk about the single unitary executive again. Does he have some information about what's going to happen if we don't deal with taking Greenland? Or is it just out of ambition for the United States? To a certain degree, I think, there was this need to trust the single unitary executive, right? Although if he does take Greenland, that's not a defensive war. That's not something that requires quick, spontaneous action on the part of the president. It's either a treaty, and they agree to it, or if he wants to make war against him, he has to get Congress to declare war. There's no justification for him unilaterally going there. It's not like they're building nuclear facilities pointed right at us like Iran was, potentially, right? It's not like they're potentially facilitating drugs coming our way, gang members coming our way, and then not taking them back into the country. The stealing of elections and authoritarianism and the stealing of oil reserves and what have you. I don't see where Greenland's doing any of that kind of stuff. So it's not an Article 1, Section 10 type of thing, that's for sure. So you're looking at, if they really want to go after it, if I'm not mistaken, you're looking at an Article 1, Section 11 thing. And so is going after Greenland constitutional? I'm just trying to do clear thinking like President Oaks would ask us to. My instincts are we believe in the right of self-determination, but we also have that tradition of the founders that we're supposed to follow. We've been told. David O. McKay told us to, and President Benson told us to. And part of the tradition of the founders was a belief in adjacent territory acquisition at times, and because it's part of the common defense. It's weird, though. If your common defense constantly involves taking stuff from your neighbor, at some point that's a little crazy. However, if you've got a neighbor that's constantly like facilitating all sorts of threats to yourself, maybe at that point, you need to run your neighbor out. I've always found, I'm going to turn to a different story here separately. In the Book of Mormon, the Words of Mormon, I think is where it is, or maybe it's in the Book of Jerem, where he talks about Omni or Jerem, where he talks about um, my brother Abinadab says, the son of Abinadab says, okay, my brother went with these guys that went and settled with Zenith, the territory there. But the first group that went, now, when we're reading that record, that's just what Zenith wrote. That's just his opinion. That's just his narrative of what happened. And he says the previous man was a stubborn man, a bloodthirsty man, right? However, just at that same time, King Benjamin, who we see as one of the most righteous kings ever, uh, was the one who had run out the Lamanites that were starting to intrude into Zarahemla. The Lamanites had already been threatening to the Nephites and chased them out of the land of the first inheritance into the land of Nephi. Now they're chased out of the land of Nephi. Now they're finding them in Zarahemla and chasing the Lamanites out of there. I halfway wonder if that first captain had commands from King Benjamin or requests from King Benjamin. Hey, why don't you just go run them out of the land of Nephi? Take that again. It's a defensive position. We can't keep dealing with these guys, right? And Zenith goes along with him as part of the group. Well, what's the fruits? I look at the fruits of what Zenith did when he resisted going along with that man, that bloodthirsty, austere man, as he calls him or whatever, right? Okay, so he killed like half of the troop that was sent to go check out the land of Nephi. Caused a fight that caused half the troop to die. Then they go back and get another troop, come back and make a deal with the Lamanites, as opposed to potentially doing what their orders were. And then as they're in this treaty with the Lamanites are really just planning on taking advantage of them. And they're taxing them, taking a major percentage of their productivity, and the Lamanites are glutting themselves off of it. And you can look at the fruits too. What happened with the next generation? The next generation was the son of Zenith. He didn't seem to be inspired to be all that righteous by his father, right? And he puts down the original group of high priests and brings in ones that'll give rulings on the law that are completely inconsistent with the actual law. And so then Abinadi, this guy named Abinadi, who just happens to live in the same area, being an old man, where supposedly one of the sons of Abinadab went, right? Kind of coincidental, similar name. Seems to have the law memorized and just show up to the court of King Noah and just start spouting off Isaiah and the law of Moses and all this kind of stuff. Like he just absolutely knows the law, right? So, but anyhow, I'm coming back to, I'm looking at the fruits, and then ultimately, like, they ended up having to kill a bunch of Lamanites anyhow. They wanted to avoid killing, Zenith wanted to avoid killing these Lamanites. They ended up having to kill a bunch of them anyhow. Plus, they got a lot of their own people killed. Empowered all these corrupt priests, right, that ended up becoming some of the worst enemies that Captain Moroni had to deal with later on, if I'm not mistaken. So what are the fruits sometimes of not chasing an enemy out of an adjacent land, right? I think the Book of Mormon tells us. I think we have a hard time seeing that in the story of the account of Zenith because it's written in his own hand, in his own words. It says right there in the Book of Mormon, it's just what he wrote about what they did. And it's getting read off to the fellow Nephites. This is what happened, you guys, right? So Zenith calls himself a righteous man, a good man, not a bloodthirsty man. He refers to the other guy as a bloodthirsty guy, right? But that's Zenith's opinion. He wasn't a prophet or anything like that. And by his fruits, I'm not impressed. So maybe he was under orders from King Benjamin originally to go wipe out or to go chase off the Lamanites out of the place where previously the Nephites had been chased out of, that was originally developed by the Nephites. And he didn't want to. He wanted to be a nice guy. He wanted to be a negotiator. He wanted to, even though they were clearly enemies, and he should have seen it, right? And the fruits of the whole situation proved to me that that's what it was. And he killed off, caused a fight that killed off half of his troop. Had to kill off a bunch of Lamanites in the end anyhow. It doesn't feel inspiring to me. Just does not feel inspiring to me at all. And so maybe Trump's onto something. Maybe he has information. Remember, he's the one that's supposed to communicate with Congress. That's supposed to be one of the parts of the more perfect union. I don't know. We need to be praying for discernment. We need to be praying for our leaders. President Oaks said in defending our divinely inspired Constitution, we should be hopeful for the future of our nation. He's recently prayed in Idaho, what's the temple? Burley, Idaho temple, to preserve the Constitution and the rule of law. And there's no comma between those two. The Constitution is the rule of law. The rule of the Constitution is the rule of law. Study that. I'm going to make a video on that real soon here because I think people misunderstand what the rule of law means. If you haven't carefully studied Defending Our Divinely Inspired Constitution by Dallin H. Oaks, you're probably missing what he means by the rule of law. When he says the principles of the Constitution, fifth, our loyalty is to the principles and processes of the Constitution. It's written words, right? Look at what he just said prior to that. There were the four principles there. Our loyalty is to the separation of powers, the clear dividing lines, and what have you, to literally the text of the Constitution. So I'm straight up analyzing the text of the Constitution. James Madison intentionally changed the wording of the Constitution before presenting it for ratification to say, instead of make war, declare war, right? So potentially Trump is on decent constitutional grounds if he goes through the Article 1, Section 7 process with Congress to have them declare the war, unless he can get the treaty aspect of it done. But they are an adjacent territory. It does fit into the tradition of the founders. And we have entangling alliances, and we've been warned by our church leaders, J. Reuben Clark, Ezra Taft Benson, that this is an apostasy from the principles of our founding to be caught up in such entangling alliances. And those are apparently a concern, though. The UN agreement and the NATO agreement. It sounds like we have just as much veto power as Russia does. I'm not an expert on the UN. I love the Constitution because that's the part that the Lord said he established. So I nerd out on that. I think about studying the Arizona Constitution, all that other stuff. But in the end, the Lord said he established the United States Constitution. So guess what I study the most? Because I think it will lead to the most inspiration because it's akin to the revelations of God, the United States Constitution, right? And so I'm just trying to give my best interpretation of that as somebody who nerds out on the Constitution and President Oaks and President Nelson's or President Benson's talks, J. Reuben Clark a little bit, and those other guys. So anyhow, thanks for listening, you guys. Hopefully this is useful for somebody.